Hello, welcome to another edition of GRC Solutions TV. I'm joined today by Executive Professional Stephen Dunkerley. Stephen took part in a panel session discussing data protection and information security, and he's kindly sharing more time with us just to cover off on those topics that we discussed today for the benefit of our viewers. Thank you, Stephen.
You're welcome.
In the Compliance Forum, we mentioned PRISM in relation to the Edward Snowden case, which I'm sure most people are familiar with. Should we be concerned that government agencies are collecting intelligence without informing the public?
I think there is a public expectation that governments will do what is necessary, even in the most flexible democracies, to ensure that the public is held safe from the types of attacks that we've seen perpetrated around the world. Homeland security in the United States, of course, has changed since the events of 9/11, and certainly within Australia since the Bali bombings. In both cases, I certainly believe there's an expectation that our governments will take what steps are necessary under parliamentary oversight to ensure that we are protected from those who may seek to engage in planning and executing those types of activities.
Sure, thank you. And where staff come into possession of information and they might choose to put it on a USB stick and walk out the door, what can we do to prevent or minimise that?
If we're looking at this once it's occurred, then it's probably too late for a company.
Sure.
In the end, it always comes down to trust with individuals, and it requires leadership and the establishment of a culture within an organisation that will prevent that occurring in the first place. And I focus on culture and trust and leadership because these are about people and about relating with people, more so than the physical and technological security measures that you would otherwise put in place. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't focus on those.
Yes.
There are a range of hygiene factors that we take care of from a technology basis about putting in place the layered security to protect information. But at the end of it, what a business has to consider, taking a risk approach to this, is how they're going to get the best return on the marginal dollar spent on protecting information. And it's certainly been my experience that return on the marginal dollar spent is gained by focusing on culture and behaviour. And culture is about the behaviour of individuals from the top down within a company.
Sure.
And it's about establishing an environment where people feel compelled to protect the information with which they're entrusted.
Yes. And that sort of neatly links into the circumstances around the laptop with company director information that walked out of a building with lots of personal and personal information about those people. So could that have been handled in a better way?
Certainly, the circumstances that led up to that could have been reasonably foreseen. Now, the actual physical incident, the failure of the locking mechanism on the door, was something that may not have been foreseen. But certainly leaving that amount of data on a laptop
Yes.
in a relatively unsecured place within the business is something that, by the employment of policies and procedures within a business to protect information and to compartmentalize that information and to segregate that information, had they been followed, could well have prevented that even though the laptop itself was stolen.
Yes.
By a walk-in off the street, an opportunistic theft, as most infrastructure and device theft is. The measures taken to ensure that the data wasn't on there in the first place ought to have been in place.
Yes.
Having said that, the data was encrypted, and so a second layer of defence is there for the data that
Yes.
it even being on the machine was of no value to the casual thief,
Yes.
who in all likelihood probably sold on that device very quickly.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So we've sort of talked about willful, leaking of information and accidental. So where an email, such as the case with the New Zealand Earthquake Commission, an email was inadvertently sent out, and the recipient sought to potentially use that to protect the interests of their clients who were making claims. What's that conduct? How do you consider that sort of conduct in terms of using that information for other gains?
I think there are a couple of issues here, and dealing first with the Commission. Yes, it was inadvertent behaviour, but I think they behaved in the right way.
Yes.
By confessing the act in the first place and seeking to engage their public and the government on the measures that they then took to protect that information. And I understand that they sought an injunction to prevent the misuse of that information and the deletion of that information. And I think it was one insurance agent who subsequently saw value in at least 10 of the claims.
Yes.
And dealing with that issue, it comes down to the ethical behaviour of a business as to what do you do with information that either falls into your hands through the inadvertent release,
Yes.
Or through means over which you have no control, but which may have been illegal. Now, in this case, it wasn't. And I think it points more to the question of the ethics, the business ethics of that person and that individual, than it does to the Commission itself in the inadvertent release of the information. From a business perspective, for companies considering what they might do in the same circumstance, I believe they need to take the long-term view on the damage that might be done to the reputation to their business if they are exposed gaining advantage out of material over which there was no intention for them to have in the first place.
Sure.
That was gained through inappropriate means or that wasn't handed back when it was appropriate to do so.
Yeah, yeah. And I think we've seen businesses try to limit the potential for people to use social media, Facebook at work, that sort of thing, and now there's a lot of bring your own device elements. How do we regulate people's behaviour? You've talked about trust and training. Is it a similar sort of angle when you're talking about information that's within the domain of the organisation?
Yes, absolutely, and I think it's fruitless for companies to try and limit access to the social media. Indeed, companies now are using those tools themselves.
Sure.
To promote their business and indeed to communicate both within the business and to their clients and with government, whether it's via Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn. Certainly a number of the businesses that I've been involved with use all three.
Yes.
Deliberately as part of their overall communication strategy and their training strategy. So I think that's a good thing that we're embracing these technologies. As to how we regulate the use of these technologies that aren't company managed instances with our employees, again comes down to the culture you foster within the organisation. And in my experience, if you have very clear policies and guidelines and procedures about the use of company information and the obligations of each individual employee to protect the information that they're entrusted with or that they come into contact with, and you actually get them to sign a document where
Yes.
they commit themselves personally
Yes.
to comply with that policy, then I think you're going to end up with a culture that is going to behave the way you expect it to do so. You can't control everybody though, and that's not the intent. So I think ensuring that you have, in your hiring and your selection policies, and the way you bring people into the business, the way you induct them, and then the way you lead them and that they're managed is very important. And if they get the example shown by leaders and they're constantly kept aware of the effect that information leakage can have on a business and their clients, then in most cases people are going to comply. And I think the data bears this out, that over 90% of all of the information that is inadvertently or illegally leaked from businesses is through an external threat.
Yes.
A very small proportion actually involves people inside a business.
Yes.
And it's managing that very small proportion by having behavioural policies in place.
Yeah. Interesting stats and metrics.
Yeah.
So I guess we're now faced with the onset of another technology cab off the rank around Google Glass. I guess we don't want to run before we can walk, but what can companies do to keep up with new security risks posed by these new technologies?
Rather than trying to second guess how these technologies manifest themselves, such as Google Glass, and I do recall a few years ago now the same discussions were being held about the capability of so-called smartphones with built-in cameras.
Yes.
And that conversation publicly seems to have fizzled out. It's a technology taken for granted now. Again, I don't think companies should rush to be specific about these types of technologies, more than focusing on what behaviour do they expect of their staff.
Sure.
Now, obviously, it isn't all about behaviour and trust and leadership. There are certain measures that you do take, and if companies follow the few golden rules around protecting their information, such as classifying
Yes.
their information or structuring their information with different levels of protection required, compartmentalising that information so that only those that need it actually get to see it or access it, having access rules on information, for example, in the application of document and records management systems, password protecting access, encrypting the information while it's at rest in the archives or in the data store. Having these multi-layered approaches will ensure that you minimise the risk of exposing inadvertently information which could otherwise then be taken out of the company.
Yeah.
But if you focus on getting those measures right and on the behaviour expectations of staff and the trust obligation that they are vested with, then the issues posed by a particular technology, such as Google Glass itself, almost become irrelevant, and it's simply a matter of dealing with what you can control as opposed to what you can't.
Yeah. Including controlling not having the wrong headlines on the top of the newspapers.
Exactly.
Stephen, I'd like to thank you very much for joining our panel today, also for taking some extra time to share your comments with our viewers. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome.